Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to Cultural Anthropology. We're going to start with our first lecture, and in this lecture we're going to be talking about sort of the fundamentals of what anthropology is, the four different branches. We'll talk a little bit about the history of anthropology, and we'll talk a bit about anthropology and its relationship to globalism. Okay, so now let's go ahead and get started here. So, from my introduction, you already know some about this class, some about who I am. This is just part of that. If you need to get a hold of me, use the garrett@msudenver.edu email. If you have to use email, again, if you need to make any communications with me, use Canvas. Canvas is the best way to get a hold of me, by far. Okay, moving on. Some of my experience, former president of the High Plains Society for Applied Anthropology. I'm currently a board member for Colorado Archaeological Society in Denver. I've worked with the Ute Mountain Internship Program through Metro State and through CSU. That was for about 8 years. And then did a similar program in which we took students to Kenya as an applied anthropology field school. And then I've also published a number of films, primarily dealing with graffiti, amongst other things. Okay, what are the expectations for this semester? Basically to learn about cultural anthropology and why it's important. We're also going to be talking about why it's important, how it'll help us to experience other cultures, to understand them, to understand why they're important, and the benefit of doing so. We'll look at different cultural practices and why they're important. And we'll also understand how cultures are experiencing globalism and what that means in a sort of a cultural melting pot that we are experiencing. As sort of like a disclaimer that I like to give every semester, essentially we're going to be talking about some sensitive subjects, things that people might have strong opinions on, and that's a good thing. One of the things that I encourage people to do is to have discussions about these different things that come up in our lives, our different beliefs, our different ideas. The important thing is that anytime that we do have those discussions, that they remain civil. We need to be able to maintain civil discourse. And essentially what that means is that we're not trying to necessarily convince anyone, especially through the process of shouting or yelling. Of course, this is a virtual classroom, but we can still do that in text, right? So we want to be civil. We want to be able to have discussion and be able to walk away saying that, you know, maybe we learned more and maybe we taught someone something they didn't know, but we didn't have to do it in a belligerent way. So that's something that, you know, is really important to what we do when we look at things like bias, personal bias, cultural bias, all of those things. We have to do all of this in a very civil manner. Okay, so what is anthropology? In short, anthropology is the study of human beings. And that's a very broad thing. Humans are a huge subject, obviously. So we need to be able to break those things down into different categories, different ways of looking at things, so that we can understand them a little bit better when we put it all back together again. So to do this, we created 4 fields. We have culture, right? We have language. We have the biological or physical anthropology, which deals in things like evolution or adaptation. And then we have archaeology, which is looking at the material remains from past cultures and trying to understand how those cultures behave or behaved, and what kind of stories they left behind for us to learn about. To understand anthropology, we have to understand the scientific method. Anthropology is a science. We're not like biology, we're not like physics, we're not like math, but we are a science because we do the same thing that those other scientists do. And so we're gonna talk about that. What is science itself? It is the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study and structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. What does that mean? Basically, we see something, we want to learn about it, we come up with an idea about how it works, we test those ideas, and when we've done enough testing and we've talked to enough people, we have a theory, right? This is a means for us to understand the world. That's what science does for us. It allows us to look at things and to try and understand things and to better our understanding of our environment, and which will then lead to other ways of knowing, other ways of knowledge. Okay, so science continued. How does it work specifically? Well, you have a question. You see something and you're wondering, like, how did that happen? I'd like to learn more. So you start your research, you start reading books, you start experimenting, you start asking questions, you start talking to people. And after you've done that for enough time, then you can create a hypothesis. I believe that this is the case, right? I've done this research and I think this is the case. And now that I've done some of this research, I can narrow my focus and I can start asking more specific questions and I can start talking to more experts about this. And that's when you start testing your hypothesis, right? Looking for the cracks, looking for the things that don't fit. And once you start doing that, you start doing that research, guess what? You know, you start finding out new things. And it's going to test your hypothesis, it's going to test your ideas. And if you do enough of that testing and you put it before other experts and they're like, yeah, no, this makes a lot of sense. Now you've got all this information and you can be like, yeah, I've got a theory about this. And this is where we need to also talk about sort of the context of hypothesis and theory, because a lot of people actually get it mixed up. A hypothesis is like a very strong idea about something. Like you have a lot of information, you created this, you know, well-established hypothesis about things happen. A theory is fact. If you create a theory about something, that is a fact. That is something that is solid. It's not just a guess, right? A hypothesis is more closely related to a guess than a theory. When we talk about like the theory of relativity or the theory of gravity, right? Those things have been tested and tested and tested, and every time it gets tested, it's true, right? It's true every time. And that's when we know we have something solid, something that is absolute. And when I use the term absolute in this, it's more of like really, really close to being absolute. Theories are tough to knock down. But here's the thing about science, okay? And this is what we have to remember. It's really important to keep this in mind. Science doesn't have an ego, okay? If you're wrong, let's just say, you know, you go out, you do the research, you come up with this hypothesis, you start testing it, and all of a sudden you're like, this doesn't work. This isn't right. This isn't what I thought was happening. I learned something different, and my hypothesis is now failed. This is where science comes in and says, this is not a failure. This is actually a success, okay? Just because you weren't wrong, you weren't right about this one particular thing, does not mean that you didn't help further your goals. What it means is you eliminated a whole process. That's getting you closer to the truth, right? So the elimination of that, the failure is not a failure, it's progress. And that's where we got to get out of that sort of like human ego, like, oh, I failed, so I'm a failure. Shouldn't work like that, right? You're not a failure. It's you are just eliminating one more thing. So that's perfectly acceptable. That's the right way of doing things. So, you know, people have egos, and this happens often in all sciences. You come up with a theory, someone comes along and says, you know, that's wrong, you're wrong, and I'm going to show you how wrong you are, and then you get upset because they're challenging you, and that's ego. That has nothing to do with the evidence, right? That's just someone pushing your buttons. Doesn't matter, right? What matters is the truth. Okay, early anthropology. The effects of globalism, the early effects of globalism allows us to see sort of the creation of anthropology. And what that means is that globalism is the movement of people, the ability to communicate in broader areas and across longer distances. As we were developing this 400 or 500 years ago, people started traveling, right? It became easier to travel. And through that process, people started recording what they were seeing. A lot of early anthropologists were actually monks and missionaries because not only were they literate, right? They could write things down and record things, but they were also interested in cultures. Now, mind you, some of them were interested in converting cultures, oftentimes to Christianity. But to do that, a lot of times you'd have to learn the language. You'd have to learn the habits and the traits of that community, and then from there, then you could do your conversions, right, if that's what you're trying to do. So early anthropologists, you know, a lot of the founding is within this group of people who were traveling to different places. And then we took it a step further and started adding it into the sciences, right, and using it as more than just collecting stories and material culture from other places. We started looking at it as a science. But this all started again with early transportation, trade, communication. Let's see here. Okay, so what are the 4 fields that we'll be talking about? We have, obviously, you're in cultural. Then we have physical or biological anthropology, linguistics, and archaeological. So let's talk about each one of these. Cultural anthropology is the study and development of cultural variation, right? How do cultures change? How do they adapt? How do they interact with their neighbors? What are the things that they find important, and how do those things change over time? We interact both, we want to look at how those cultures interact with each other, right? Neighbor to neighbor, within their community and outside of their community. We're looking at both historical and contemporary culture, so we want to know what happened in you know, decades or centuries in the past and how that has impacted contemporary or current cultures. We look to compare and contrast different cultures. What makes this culture do this? What makes this culture do that? Why are they engaging in this kind of behavior? And what's causing that to happen? And then uses ethnographic research to compile that information and tries to understand that culture and how it became that way and how it might change in the future. Now, when I talk about ethnographic, and you might recognize, you know, part of that word like ethnic, ethnicity, that term is oftentimes referring to culture, okay? They're essentially talking about the same thing. So when we talk about ethnographic research, we're doing cultural research. Okay, physical anthropology. Physical anthropology, we're looking at the biological evolution and origin of the human species. Now, we're not just looking at humans, we're looking at also how humans have interacted with like the great apes, okay, or other animals. We look at such as like chimpanzees and orangutans, the great apes. And then, as I was saying, with other animals such as like dogs and horses, right? Domesticated animals, wild animals. How have we impacted the environment around us through our cultural development? We look at how, in physical anthropology, how bones have changed and why they might have changed. We look at things like disease and mortality, right? How did people get sick and did they die of it? And can we tell those things from the bones that are left behind? And a lot of times, yes. Yeah, we can tell a lot from your bones. So let's see, linguistic anthropology. Linguistic anthropology is language. How does language change and adapt to new situations? Different cultures have different focal languages, right? Even within English, not all of English is the same, right? Doctors have to learn a focal language, the things that are related to their study. Gamers have a focal language, things that are directly related to gaming. So language deviates in all these different ways. And then they are also connected to each other, right? How is English related to Germanic languages, to Scandinavian languages, to Latin languages, right? Because they've got all these different connections to these different cultures. And if we compare those things, we can start tracing things like migration and how culture has changed over the years. We also understand that language is fundamental to culture, absolutely fundamental. Language defines reality, right? The words that we have to use help us describe the things that we see and understand. If we don't have a word for it, we don't comprehend it, right? Other cultures, other languages have words that we don't have here in English, right? And it describes a certain concept, a certain idea that we don't or might not have the same grasp of. That's why it's important to understand those other languages so that we can understand the importance that they place upon their world and how they see things, which will help us better understand the world because we are learning more about the world around us and how we might interpret it. And then we have archaeology, and this is the study of material culture, right? This is what people have left behind for us to, in the case of most archaeologists, dig up, right? So it helps us to understand what people were using at the time, how they were using it, the things that they found important, the things that they took with them, the things that they might have taken into their graves with them. What happens to things when they break? What do they do with them? How they lived, how they dealt with the world around them through material culture, because that's oftentimes all that we might have, right? Lots of cultures didn't develop literacy in the same way that we know it, like writing stuff down. And so their storytelling, their passing of knowledge was done orally, right, from one person to another through storytelling. And sometimes that doesn't always survive. Cultures have disappeared over time, and all that's remaining is the things that they left behind. And so that helps us to understand those previous cultures and what happened to them. And that can help us understand what might happen to us in the future. Okay. anthropology has those four main fields, but we also have lots of subfields. So I'll talk briefly about some of these, but there are a lot more. So we have things like medical, forensic, applied, visual, cybernetic, underwater archaeology, and there's new fields coming along all the time that are exploring those various subjects. So medical anthropology, really important to understand because we have anthropologists that are working with, say, doctors and patients. And this is important because let's say you have someone that is coming in from another culture and they're going to see a doctor and they don't understand not only the language or the concepts, right? Say you come from a community that doesn't have Western doctors. And our Western doctors have a certain way of doing things, right? We think it's, usually the right way because we've been taught in this culture that doctors are very smart and educated and they know what they're talking about. But in this other culture, let's say a village from Guatemala, right, where they might not have that Western doctor, but they might have a healer in that community, and that healer has a certain way of doing things. They come to the United States, they come here and they get sick and they go to a Western doctor, and there's a loss of communication. Something is lost in translation, right? That healing isn't taking place because there's a knowledge barrier. Medical anthropologists can step in and help both doctor and patient understand how medicine works in each community and be able to bridge those two cultures and allowing them to deal with that. Medical anthropologists also look for healing techniques, things that are outside of, say, Western medicine, but might be found and be commonplace in other communities and cultures, right? We have, and not even joke, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of different plant species around the world, right? Sometimes they are very localized. When we look around our own culture here, we have hundreds of plants, right? But we can pick out a lot of the base ones. In other parts of the world, you might have very localized areas of plants that only live in this small region because they are adapted to that area. And there are going to be people that understand those plants because they've been living in that area for millennia. And they use those plants all the time, and all of a sudden they're healing things, right? They're capable of healing illnesses. And so we want to find out about that so that maybe we can use that to, integrate into our own medical field and expand upon it and hopefully be able to make cures for more diseases. So yeah, it oftentimes looking for that bridge, for those unknown aspects of healing and medicine between different cultures. We have forensic anthropology, oftentimes in the role of the pathologist, looking at the human remains, the bones of an individual. And from those bones we can understand how they died, how they lived. There's a lot you can tell from the health of a bone, right? The kinds of things that they experienced, trauma, disease, level of nutrition, pain, the kind of work that they might have done, because all of those things impact your bones. And so we can look at those bones and say, this person was probably a laborer. And because we can look at their legs or their arms and see how they were stretched and pulled and manipulated. And you can say, well, this person died from trauma, because all of a sudden you see broken bones in different places and not any healing from those. Or you could see that early in their life they had a traumatic experience, but that bone healed. Right? We can see all of those things and figure out how that person lived. Oftentimes these forensic anthropologists are working with federal agencies like the FBI or state agencies trying to figure out what happened to maybe modern day crime or death or stuff like that. An interesting thing to consider, I don't know if any of you have ever watched the show Bones. I loved that show. I thought it was fantastic because it's about anthropology and science. Funny enough, the science in that show is terrible. It's absolutely terrible. We don't have hardly, if any, of those machines that can just spit out stuff and be like, oh, here's the DNA, or oh, here's this. It takes a lot more time and effort to come up with those things. Nonetheless, great show to watch. Applied anthropology, this is actually a field that I've spent a lot of time in myself, and this is where we usually get invited into a culture to look at maybe they've got a particular issue going on in their community, and they want someone to come in and help them figure out that issue. And so what we would try and do is create culturally sensitive and sustainable solutions to whatever's happening in that culture. Because here's the thing, we've especially in Western culture, we've gone to a lot of places around the world and said, we know the answer. We're going to fix you, right? And usually doesn't work. It's really difficult to impose one culture's set of ideals and answers onto another culture, especially if they're, fairly different, and have those solutions work. So the idea is that we will create something that can come from within a community, have it be their own idea, and that helps to make it a sustainable idea, right? We can come up with all kinds of solutions, but will it work? Will it work within that community? So applied is oftentimes looking at those sort of those solutions that can come from within a community that will sustain itself. Visual anthropology, this is definitely a part of where I come from. Visual anthropology is looking at not only the visual arts, but creating visual art. So that's like the doing documentary work, doing photography, even like 3D generated environments. All of those things can sort of fall within visual anthropology. My particular focus is on documentary films and multimedia. How do you create content for anthropology about another culture or a group of people and be able to disseminate it to the public and make it interesting, make it consumable, right? And that's an interesting question to think about, right? How do we learn things and then translate it so that someone that doesn't understand it, we can make it easy for them to understand. So we use different media types to do that and try to understand how that happens. And that also is about how culture is passed within our own culture, right? If we're talking about, say, American culture, how does media influence the way that we think, right? What are the things that we are told? What are the things that we believe, and how does that stuff get, disseminated, put out there, right? Cybernetic anthropology. I really like this one, if only because I'm a big sci-fi geek. So I love me some Star Trek and Star Wars, right? And we got Locutus here. This is Picard from Star Trek. And it's interesting to think about how we interact with our technology. And this whole series is kind of about that. How do humans interact with the technology that we use? One of the things I think is kind of fascinating, I grew up in the 80s and 90s where, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have a way of having instant communication between parents and children. So one of the interesting things that's happened to me is that I remember a time when I could leave the house and not have a cell phone. Now if I leave my home and I forget to bring my cell phone or something like that, I get anxiety. Like, oh, what if somebody tries to get a hold of me? What if I miss something important? What if I need to look something up? What if? And it creates this anxiety in me because of technology, right? It's become so ingrained in our daily lives, and it's having physiological and emotional impacts. What happens when that disappears? What happens when it's no longer available? So we're looking at that. We're also looking at how technology interacts with the body, right? Pacemakers, artificial limbs, even things like wearing glasses, right? Glasses are technology. It helps us to see better, right? Especially if you've got some sort of visual impairment. That's technology, right? And how that technology is also changing, right? So how do we deal with technology? How does it impact us? Even something that I heard a story the other day. They were talking about how humans interact with light. And one of the interesting ideas is that, we've only had truly artificial light for the last 120 years, right? Where you can flip on a switch that generates or releases electricity to go to a light bulb that then lights up that light bulb. And we can now sit in a room or sit outside and it's midnight, but we can still see and do things. And it's interesting to think about how that has changed our lives, because it's had a dramatic effect, right? We can jump in our car and we can drive until 2 o'clock in the morning and be safe because we have lights on that car to be able to see where we're going. So it's changed transportation. It's changed working hours. It's changed our biological responses, right? When it used to get dark, people went to bed, whether that was 7 p.m., 8 p.m., 9 p.m., 10 p.m., right? It didn't matter what time of year it was. When it got dark, that was time to go to bed. When it got light, people got up. Now, that circadian rhythm, that natural rhythm that we have developed over the millennia, over tens and hundreds of thousands of years of not having that artificial light, is now being disrupted. What happens to us now? Ooh, fascinating. Even just thinking about those little things like light. So yeah, right? There's cool things that we can look at. So what else is there? Right? What other things can we do? Well, I've worked with other anthropologists who study gaming, right? The anthropology of gaming, right? They are oftentimes working within subcultures, right? World of Warcraft or Call of Duty, right? Where you have this distinct gaming culture that has its own focal language, that has its own senses of identity that are oftentimes, created through these avatars. And they do different things, and you can create a totally different identity that is maybe it's not the same gender, maybe it's not the same sexuality, maybe it's not the same species, right? So there's freedom in those choices. Different profession, maybe you want to do something different than what you're doing in your regular life. So, there's gaming, there's just about anything that you look at, you can find an anthropologist that's interested in studying it, right? And it can have big impacts. Okay, so we're going to end it here. Oh, one more thing. Holism. Holism is the commitment to looking at the entire picture, right? Anthropology is the study of humans. We can't know or understand the study of humans unless we know how all of it comes together. Okay, it's all the fields, it's everything. It gives us sort of a final picture of everything. So like throughout the semester, we're going to be talking about, we'll talk about culture, we'll talk about language, we're going to talk about gender and race and all of these different things, but these are not separate things. These are all interconnected things. They all fit together, right? Because you can't have one without the other. Culture isn't just one piece here and one piece there and one piece here. It's all of these different things. So we have to put all those things together. Okay, that's it for now. Next video, we will continue with the rest of the lecture. Okay, we'll see you then.